Recently, I hit 1,000 subscribers, and in celebration, I wanted to make a video covering the history of the Pokemon TCG, or at least the modern history, which is black and white on. And I decided thematically it would make sense if I covered 1,000 cards, the 1,000 best cards over the past 13 or so years, and showcase them. In this video, I'm not going to be talking about every single card individually, though I will be showing 1,000 different cards and trying to run through the modern history of the Pokemon TCG and not spend too long either, because let's be honest, we don't want to be sitting here for 5 hours. So before we hop into things, I just want to ask you to subscribe. This video took a really long time, and at my next big subscriber milestone, I would make a video like this but cover the entire history of the Pokemon TCG and also more aspects that I didn't cover here because I only talked about standard here, but there are some other formats that are really cool too. Also, I'd love to make a video with higher audio quality, video quality, but don't worry, this video is pretty good too. I guess the best place to start off with are the trainer cards. These are the backbone of every Pokemon TCG deck, and that is no exception in the black and white era. These trainers were super good, and a lot of them are still in the format today, or at least they have very similar cards in format. And the supporter cards were crucial, the end cards were also crucial, and the other cards were important, I guess. But there were some crazy trainers and some crazy stories, but we don't need to spend too long on these. Just know that these cards are really good, and a lot of them are legal later on, but I won't be mentioning them there. I'll just be mentioning them here. But enough with trainers, right? Who cares about them? Let's talk about the Pokemon, and we got some really cool ones, although they were mostly basic Pokemon. But let's start with some of the single prizers. Pretty much these had high HP, high damage, and were just good. The black and white era of Pokemon was much simpler than it is today, but these cards are just classics. However, there were a number of evolution single prizes that saw a lot of play. Admittedly, most of these were just, well, item lock and paralysis, but there were some really cool ones that involved drawing lots of cards, really unique abilities, really interesting attacks, and a lot of damage manipulation to account for lower damage outputs. Moving to the second year, we see Ultra Ball, Double Colorless Energy, and Rare Candy. And Rare Candy was in the game before, but we're just covering it here now because of weird ordering stuff, because of how I created this and the cutoffs and stuff. But anyways, these cards are so good. They literally changed the game. If they weren't in the game, it would be completely different. And there were some other really cool trainers as well. However, if you're familiar with the Pokemon TCG during the Black and White era, you probably think of Mewtwo EX, as well as some other basic EXs. They were so strong and so dominant, and Mewtwo EX just completely beat everything. Its attack was easy to pay and could ramp up to one-shotting stuff. Also, it hit itself for weakness, so Mewtwo EX's best counter was Mewtwo EX. This was an interesting design decision by Pokemon, but just know that this card was absolutely bonkers. The other great basic EX of this era was Darkrai EX. This card was so good. It's just a Darkness EX, and it's good. There's some more of these that we'll see later. Darkness is a type that's had just a bunch of really strong basic Pokemon, but Darkrai paired with Mewtwo EX or other things was very good, and also Sableye was another card that was a strong Darkness partner, and that got banned and expanded, but that's for another day. Well, I guess Rayquaza EX was also a really important and really impactful basic EX. It could one-shot pretty much anything, but it did take a lot of setup, and you'd set this up using Electric, which accelerating energy to any type of Pokemon, including Mewtwo EX. So we're just coming back to Mewtwo EX. Pretty much all big basics all the time, and they were really, really strong as well. The Black and White era also introduced us to A-Spec cards, which were really powerful items that you could only play one of in your deck, one of any of the A-Specs. So if you played one, such as Computer Search, you couldn't play, for example, Life Do. And Computer Search was definitely the best one, so that kind of pushed all the other ones out of the game, but not entirely. Other ones saw some play, and there are also some counters to ace specs, and counter cards are going to be turned upside down or sideways or something, so just know that when you see cards like that. YOLO gets Keldeo EX, another big basic attacker with energy acceleration in the form of Blastoise. That's right, Pokemon did a lot of big basics with a lot of energy acceleration at this time. And Blastoise also accelerated to some other Pokemon, including Articuno, which took extra prize cards. And honestly, Blastoise was a really iconic deck, and Arceus in the whole, a really weird supporter and honestly, just a really strong deck that we saw a lot of similar decks like this later on, but we'll get to those later. Okay, I guess we got another big basic with Stage 2 Energy Acceleration. It's back again, although admittedly, Metal wasn't as good. Well, let's have a little change of pace here and talk about some single prize Pokemon. The most notable Pokemon here is Garbodor, which ability locked your opponent and yourself, so it paired really well with big basics. Yeah, it helped big basics again. But there were some other pretty cool Pokemon here, some that walled the EX Pokemon, And then there are also some interesting evolutions. There are just some cool Pokemon here. Well, I hope you enjoyed that change of pace because we're back to big basics. And this time we're introducing our first new mechanic, which is the Plasma mechanic. These were just Pokemon that said the word Plasma on them, but they interacted and synergized pretty interestingly, and they powered each other up, boosted each other's damage, just did some pretty cool things. Oh, and we also got a Snorlax that definitely won't be problematic later. But let's move on to some more black and white trainers. These include the incredibly powerful supporter Culvis and the even more powerful supporter Getsis, who's got banned, although it wasn't actually that powerful at the time. It was good, but not broken. But then Hypnotoxic Laser and Burbank City Gym, as well as Silver Bangle, I guess, combined to allow so much damage to be dealt to Pokemon. It was just insane, and we got a bunch of really good switching cards, just a bunch of great cards this year. Speaking of great cards, we got some amazing support Pokemon as well. We got some defensive ones and some really powerful aggressive ones that allow you to do some weird combos, but were just pretty cool. One of the coolest single prize decks at this time was the Flareon deck, where you got a bunch of Pokemon in your discard, and of course it is an evolution, so it had some other cool support Pokemon as well, but overall just a really fun and iconic Pokemon from the time. But the best deck of the black and white era has to be Virgin. Yeah, I'm not the one naming the decks here, but Virizion Genesect was so powerful, just straight up big basics, massive damage, paired with an A-Spec plasma stuff, pretty much a culmination of all the great black and white era stuff, and this deck was just unstoppable. The beginning of X and Y gave us even more great trainers. We got Lysander and Professor Sycamore, which kind of came back, but it's complicated, and a bunch of great items too. But X and Y is probably most known for the Fairy type, which is the 11th type in the Pokemon TCG that then later got removed. But in the X and Y era, it was really solid. Also, why is there the Sideways card? We'll talk about that later. The Fairy type was matched against the Darkness type, and Darkness had some really great basic EXs, just like in the Black and White era. We also got a ton of really cool single prize Pokemon. There were a bunch of supporting Pokemon like Crobat and Golbat, as well as some solid attackers like Raichu, and we also got Trevenant, and there's a sideways Trevenant there too. So I guess I should talk about them. They're Pokemon Break, and they're sideways. Yeah, that's pretty much it. They're like weird evolutions that kind of do some stuff. I've talked about them in the past, and I'll talk about them more later, though. However, we've stayed away from big basics long enough, so we're back, and the X and Y era had some insane basic EXs, including Seismitoad EX, which was just absurdly good. It actually ended up getting a bunch of cards banned. This card, I mean, this is insane. It pretty much stopped your opponent from playing any cards, and there were also some other basics that were okay, and there was also double dragon energy, which really helped dragon Pokemon, but mostly it's just Seismitoad. Wait, are those more metal big basics paired with metal energy acceleration? Didn't we just see that a little while ago? But I've avoided talking about it long enough. It's time to talk about control. We got Warlord EX, which was it was just big. We also got some insane recovery cards, weird disruption cards, and control just started becoming really, really strong at this time. But we'll get to that later as well. Anyways, the second year of X and Y started, and wow, we got some insane turns, including Battle Compressor, which is just so good, and Versus Seeker, which is also so good. We also get Judge, which I think we kind of saw before, but not in this video, and a ton of amazing supporters, pretty interesting items, and these cards were really insane. If people are ever talking about expanded format and broken trainers, these are these trainers. Speaking of broken cards, we got Shaymin EX, and this card had an insane on-play ability that just let you draw so many cards and it could stack, and it was really broken. And we also got Megas, including Mega Rayquaza EX. But we also got a bunch of other really solid Mega EXs. They had these Spirit Link cards that let them essentially ignore their mechanic, which is kind of weird. I've talked about them in the past, but they were really solid and were really powerful additions to the EX mechanic. However, a much rarer occurrence actually happened at this time, and that was that grass Pokemon were actually really good. Vileplume and Vespiquen, though mostly just Vileplume, as well as a new Stadium Force of Giant Plants, allowed grass Pokemon to be insanely powerful, and Vileplume could turn one item lock your opponent, which is just absurd. This card saw a lot of play with a lot of different Pokemon, and single prizes were really solid at this point. The other great single prizer at this time was Garbodor, which ability lock your opponent. It's the same as the Garbodor we talked about earlier, but it's actually different. It's weird, but anyways, between Garbodor and Vileplume, you couldn't really do much to counter really anything. It was a little weird, but still, single prizes were really solid. And one of the most notable single prize Pokemon were also the Night March Pokemon, which were just really powerful single prize attackers with really low HP, but they were really strong. Anyways, let's move on to the final year of X and Y, where we got some really powerful trainer cards that either helped basic Pokemon or control strategies. And actually, most of the new Pokemon EX of this era actually were very defensive in nature, and they helped you wall off your opponent's Pokemon and defend. and were just generally kind of annoying to deal with, but also pretty strong. But now it's time to talk about one of the most infamous Pokemon decks ever, and that's Greninja Break. Greninja Break is it's a Pokemon Break, and I haven't really talked about these too much, but Pokemon Break are these sideways Pokemon that were evolutions on top of the previous evolution, and so Greninja a stage 2, now Greninja Break is essentially a stage 3. So that sounds very inconsistent, and it was. But then when it popped off, it had this insane ability that was just really solid and really great stats and stuff like that. And then it kept these stats of the previous evolution as well. So you had this Pokemon that could ability lock and spread all this damage. And it was a single prizer, but then it didn't always set up. It was really annoying, really powerful when it got going, and just it's Ninja Break. It is what it is. Anyways, moving on from that mess, let's move into the Sun and Moon era. The Sun and Moon era was really interesting, and we saw a bunch of staple trainers again moving into the first year, of course. We see a bunch of ball cards, a bunch of really solid supporters, and just some really cool cards in general. Yo, look, it's big basics again. We got big basic GXs. GXs are not EXs, they are different because they have GX attacks, which are once per game attacks. You can only use one GX attack throughout the entire game. So you might want to use it on one Pokemon or on another Pokemon. It just depends on the deck. Not every deck used them, but they were pretty good and pretty powerful. But, of course, once per game. So just got to keep that in mind. And keep that in mind as we talk about GXs because they really completely define this era. And, the best one was definitely Tapu Lele GX, at least during this time. It had an amazing ability and a solid attack, and was really versatile and nice and good and really, really, honestly healthy for the game. Mewtwo EX, we talked about earlier, that card was kind of busted. This card has the same attack, but was nowhere near as game defining as Mewtwo EX. Fire Pokemon EX and Fire Pokemon GX also teamed up to create some really solid decks, although they weren't game breaking or anything like that. But don't worry, Pokemon GX weren't just basic Pokemon. There were a bunch of really powerful evolution GXs, including Gardevoir GX, which was a really solid Stage 2. And this is really the first time that Stage 2s are really solid attacking options. We got Decidueye GX, Glaciopod GX, Sylveon GX, Alolan Ninetales GX, and just a bunch of really good GXs that were honestly shockingly tame. They did damage that wasn't just all one shots, but was really, two shotting, maybe three shotting. And we had the GX attacks, which allowed for really interesting game plans that you needed to think about, but didn't completely define the game. Also, most of the Pokemon GX had a bunch of different attacks or abilities, so they had a lot of different options, and this is honestly generally regarded as one of the best eras in the Pokemon TCG history. Of course, at this time, there were also a ton of really cool single prize Pokemon. There was Garbodor, which is a really strong single energy attacker. There was some defensive Pokemon. There was also Marshadow, which was really nasty and later got banned and expanded. But then there was also Counter Energy, which was a really powerful special energy that only worked with single prize Pokemon, so it really balanced things out a bit. But enough of that balance. Let's welcome in Zoroark GX. Zoroark GX, in addition to being hard for me to say, is a card that is really, really powerful. It does everything. It draws cards, attacks for lots of damage, has solid HP, and it was really good. And paired with a lot of different cards, a lot of which aren't even featured on screen here, it completely dominated the metagame. It was insane. And Zoroark GX paired with so many interesting cards allowed for a weird meta very much centered around Zoroark, but also there were other decks that were definitely viable at the time. And I guess now's as good a time as any to talk about the fighting type Pokemon. Strong Energy was an amazing special energy card and one of the best ever, and it really allowed fighting Pokemon to be really solid in the late X and Y era and also into the Sun and Moon era. The fighting type Pokemon were highlighted by some Buzzwoles as well as a bunch of other Pokemon, but they were really pretty simple. They just did lots of damage and were just strong. The fact that they hit weakness on Zoroark GX certainly did not hurt either. But what type are fighting weak to? Psychic. And Malamar highlighted Psychic type, allowing for a lot of energy acceleration. We saw this in the past with Electric, but now we see it with Psychic, and it's even better with Malamar allowing for a lot of different attackers, some which are single prizes, some which are multi prizers, and they just took the metagame not necessarily by storm, but were a very solid type. Yo, look, it's more big basics with mental acceleration. They're back. They're still pretty mid, but here they are. But moving into the second year of Sun and Moon, we come to some really interesting trainers. We have some strong supporters, strong special energy, strong stadiums, strong items, strong tools, all that stuff. And the best card of them is Cynthia, just a really solid draw supporter. While many of the Sun and Moon decks I mentioned before were really good, one of the big new ones coming into the second year was Rayquaza GX, which had a really strong damage output and was simply a big basic, kind of similar to the Rayquaza EX we saw before. We also got a solid single prize water deck focused around Quagsire. We got some interesting decks as well that were single prizes such as Garchomp and Granbull, but the star of the show here has to be Lost March, which introduced the Losso mechanic. It was in the game before, but not in this video so far. And it's like the discard pile, but it's different. I don't know. It's a weird thing. However, arguably the biggest thing from this year was the Ultra Beast mechanic, which was a new mechanic that is kind of like Plasma and some other mechanics we're going to talk about later. But pretty much Ultra Beast are Pokemon that interact interestingly with prize cards. We had the insanely powerful Blacephalon GX, which literally had an attack that just let you take a prize, which was pretty insane, and a bunch of other really interesting Ultra Beast cards that were kind of weird but kind of cool too. Coming into the final year of Sun and Moon, we got some more trainers. These were pretty solid and a pretty wide variety, but nothing that stands out that much. However, if you know anything about the third year of Sun and Moon, you know that it was dominated by Tag Team GXs, which were Pokemon GXs that were basic Pokemon that had insane stats but gave up three prizers. And the first one of them was Pikachu and Zekrom GX, which was a lightning type paired with a lot of other really powerful lightning Pokemon and other support cards that allowed it to become an insane Pokemon that dominated the meta. There were, however, a ton of different tag team Pokemon that saw play, and here are just some, but we will be covering some more later. Keep in mind, though, there were also tag team cards that were supporters, which were a little different, but they're just regular supporters pretty much. Anyways, let's stop talking about tag teams for a moment and let's talk about some of the insane support Pokemon we got during the late Sun and Moon era, including the insane Dedenne GX, although we got a bunch of other ones that either drew lots of cards or really disrupted your opponent a lot. There are also some single prize attackers that were just pretty cool. Again, these were not super good at this time, but they were okay. But whoa, what is that? That is control, right? Control is really good and really started to get good at this time with some insane cards that I mean pretty much stop your opponent from playing cards altogether. However, one of the craziest decks in this time was Mewtwo and Mew Tag Team GX, which copied other GXs from your discard pile. And these included tag teams and stage 2s and stage 1s. So this allowed you to have one Pokemon that just had so many different attacks that could really just beat everything. One of the other big decks at this time were the Fire decks, centered around the powerful supporter Welder, letting you draw cards and accelerate energy, and paired with Reshiram and Charizard, an insane tag team, arguably the best one ever. You could create decks with a ton of different attackers that could just wipe out your opponent, and this was also sometimes paired with Mewtwo and Mew. However, Fire's dominance certainly was not enough to stop Zacian V and Metal Pokemon paired with cards like Metal Saucer in the notoriously kind of broken Arceus and Dalian Palkia GX, which literally let you take extra prizes the entire game, which is it's just absurd. And there were some really good cards here that really warped the meta. But while Zacian V was really the poster child for Sword and Shield, we also got a ton of insane trainers. These included just a ton of great supporters, including Boston's Orders and Professor's Research. We have seen Lysander and Professor Juniper or Sycamore in the past, but these unified them all into one card, respectively, between Boss and Research. Those were just two great supporters that we'll see later on, and truly Pokemon's way of kind of fixing the staple cards. And we also saw a bunch of other insane item cards and also good supports and stuff. But Boss and Research were really game defining and are still game defining. But we also got a bunch of support Pokemon, or at least a few, including some Pokemon V, which I didn't talk about before. They're pretty much the same as Pokemon EX. They have up two prizes and stuff, but they're here, that's fun. But Pokemon V evolved in Pokemon V Max, which gave up three prizes and were kind of similar to Mega Evolutions, but were just better and stronger and really started to take over the metagame. The first main one was Dragapult V Max, but we got a bunch of other ones that just saw a ton of play. And one of those was a Eternatus VMAX, an insane darkness type Pokemon VMAX that had 340 HP. What? That's so much. And it paired with a bunch of other great Pokemon, including Crobat V. And we also saw some Pokemon GX that we haven't talked about yet. See play with Eternatus and also had a bunch of counters. But Eternatus was just a really powerful VMAX and arguably the most powerful ever. We did get a few single prize decks during this time period, notably some that were very defensive and a couple of high power ones, but they were mostly pushed out of the format due to some of the really powerful tag teams and VMAXs. You know the drill by now. New year, new trainers. These were okay, but nothing too special. Wait, what? Why is this one so big though? Path to the Peak? What is this card? Wait, it stops all rulebox abilities? Okay, that's pretty good. Path to the Peak really defined the game at this time because it turned off all rulebox abilities. We talked about Eternus VMAX, we talked about Crobat V, we talked about Dene GX, we talked about Mewtwo and Mew. These cards were all really good. Path to the Peak just stopped them. It just said, you don't get to play the game. This card was insane. And yeah, normally if counters turned sideways, not this time though. Path to the Peak defined the game, and counters also defined the game. This card was so good. This year we also got the battle styles mechanic, which were kind of like the Ultra Beasts or the Plasma Pokemon, and Single Strike was the first one, and pretty much it just said the Pokemon that were Single Strike did more damage. It was pretty boring, but the Pokemon were alright. However, Rapid Strike Pokemon were much cooler and also a bit better. They had Pokemon that did spread damage and also Pokemon that really synergized with switching and were honestly just pretty fun. However, the big challenger to the Rapid Strike and Single Strike Pokemon was Shadow Rider Calyrex VMAX. This was an insanely powerful Psychic Pokemon VMAX, and I'm sure we're never going to see another Psychic Pokemon VMAX like it ever again that's this dominant. Anyways, this is the year that the Intellion engine came into its own. It came out the year before, but with Path to the Peak coming out this year, it was really the best engine because it was really consistent and also it synergized really well with the Pokemon VMAX that were evolutions, and it also was not hurt by Path to the Peak. We also saw some more single prize attackers seeing play, although honestly, most of them were more on the side of what you describe as fun Pokemon instead of competitive. But we did also see the third battle style, Fusion Strike, come out at the end of the year. And man, this was insane. Genesect V is really good. We talked about Shaymin EX earlier and Zacian V, and both those cards were really, really good. Genesect V was them combined for the Fusion Strike deck, headlined by Mew VMAX. This was an insane VMAX and probably the best. It's debatable, but it had some insane stats, being able to just be so absurdly good. And it was also a psychic Pokemon that was weak to darkness, just like Shadow Rider, and completely, well, overshadowed it. And VMAX is potentially one of the best Pokemon ever, or at least best decks ever, because it was so good. Anyways, here are some new trainers. You know the drill. We also got a new cast of supporting Pokemon, though these weren't nearly as good as some of the ones we've seen before, but still pretty solid. However, the star of the show has to be Arceus VSTAR, with its insane ability allowing you to set up and its attack also helping you set up, and just a solid attacker. It very much resembles Zoroark GX, which we talked about, and Pokemon VSTARs are also very much like Pokemon GX, except they're kind of like VMAXs. They're a little weird, but they have GX attacks in the form of V-Star powers, which are their abilities or attacks. Don't worry about it too much. All you need to know is that it enabled a ton of other decks as well, just like Zoroark. We also got a new mechanic in Radiant Pokemon, which are pretty much like the Ace-Spec cards from earlier, but with Pokemon, and the best one's Radiant Greninja. There's not too much to say about them, but Radiant Greninja was really good. And it was certainly helped out because water was so good at this time, with Origin Form Palkia V-Star and some other really good cards, including Melanie, which is kind of like a welder we talked about before, but it's a little different. But anyways, water was a really great type, and it was probably the best type at this time as well. Oh, look, Metal's back. It's not that good still, but it's okay, and it has some energy acceleration. This time it's moved up from a basic to an evolution. Yay! Uh-oh. Okay, so now we're talking about control yet again with Snorlax, and this card was actually essentially featured in the video before, but then it got essentially reprinted, and I don't know why it was reprinted. It was kind of toxic before, but I kind of glossed over it. But it pretty much stopped your opponents from playing the game, and it's pretty good. Control with the Sword and Shield era became really strong, but we may be coming back to it again later as well. But just know the control was really good and really annoying at this time due to a lot of different cards as well. However, Sword and Shield might have had what is the best single prize deck we've ever seen. It's not entirely single prizers, but it's focused around the Lost Zone, and this time it's much better than the Lost March deck, which was somewhat mediocre. This is the Lost Zone engine featuring Comfy and some other cards as well that had a really powerful damage output, energy acceleration, and versatility, making it one of the best decks in the game. Also, by this time we were accumulating a few different V-Stars which were seeing play, nothing too special, but they were also pretty solid. However, the best Pokemon V-Star, if not Arceus, is definitely Lugia V-Star, paired with Archeops, which allowed you to put your Archeopses into play without having to evolve them normally, and then you could accelerate an absurd amount of special energies. Like, there were so many good ones, and this was an insane combo. It enabled some really crazy attackers, including the amazing rares, which had insane attack costs, but because you could accelerate essentially as much energy as you wanted, you could pay these insane attack costs, and then the attacks essentially just did whatever you wanted on single prize Pokemon. Lugia was insane. Oh, also Fire's back. I didn't really know where to include it, but it's just some big basics that have solid damage output. Pretty boring stuff, but it is moderately solid. So here it is. But we finally made it. We're on to the Scarlet and Violet era, and of course, starting things off, we have new trainers. A lot of the older ones got reprinted as well, but Iono was a new one. That's actually not that new. It's the same as N, but like technically different. It has more words. But this card's really good and arguably the best card in the TCG right now. However, the biggest change to trainers with the Scarlet and Violet era has to be with tool cards, which were no longer grouped into the item cards. And they got a lot of new tools and tool support, which made them really, really powerful. The top deck of the Scarlet and Violet era has to be Gardevoir EX, headlined by, of course, Gardevoir EX itself, accelerating essentially infinite energies, and Curlia, which was from the Sword and Shield era, but an insanely good draw engine. It's Zoroark GX's ability we saw earlier, but its previous evolution to one of the best Pokemon in the game, and is paired with a wide number of attackers that were really strong too. Don't worry though, we still got a bunch of big basics, notably in the form of lightning Pokemon paired with some various forms of energy acceleration, which were capable of taking one shots or two shots and had high HP for basic Pokemon as well. And this was headlined by the legendary Miraidon EX, a really strong attacker. And wait, it's an EX that's back? Well, it's complicated. The EXs are not the same as the old EXs, but then they kind of are. There's a reason I'm not going back to the entire history. It gets very complicated, and I think it involves like hyphens and stuff. It's really weird. But anyways, this is a different EX than the one we talked about earlier in the video, although Miraidon EX here functions the same as the old EXs. Don't worry about it too much. The third type that really shined during the Scarlet and Violet era is the Water type, featuring Chien-Pao EX with Excalibur, allowing for very similar combos to Keldeo and Blastoise that we saw earlier. We also got some pretty cool EXs that were basics in stage ones, although this was not a big basic dominated format, though there certainly were a few good ones. But we also got Trapgos EX, probably the most exciting one, which actually isn't out at the time of recording this, but a really, really cool Pokemon, just in general. However, the stars of the show have to be the Stage 2 EXs, headlined by Charizard EX, an insanely powerful Pokemon, and Dragapult EX, which is pretty good currently, but is going to get better in the future. And Stage 2s, this is really the best Stage 2s have been in pretty much this entire video. And they're really powerful and just have absurd HPs, honestly. We also got ourselves some single prize decks that are pretty solid, including United Wings, which is kind of like Night March. It's actually very similar, but nowhere near as good, but still a pretty cool deck. Speaking of cool, we got Control. Yeah, Control was also improved a lot during this time with some really powerful trainer cards and solid Pokemon as well. But defensive decks got really powerful at this time, and as these are cards that are coming out now, Control's pretty good. Arguably the best deck in the game with the Snorlax we talked about earlier. But we also got the return of Ace Specs, which are now pink, which is pretty cool. I mean, they're not that good compared to the old ones. Prime Catcher is good, and some other ones are solid, but Computer Search is always going to be the best one. The last mechanic we have to talk about are the Paradox Pokemon, where we're going to start with the Ancient Pokemon. And Ancient Pokemon are kind of like the Ultra Beast mechanic, or the Plasma mechanic, or the Battle Styles mechanic. They're pretty much the same, it's just a name, but these are all basic Pokemon, but they had a really high HP and just really good stats in general. And with that, the video is almost over. I mean, I guess all we need to talk about now is the future. No, like literally the future or the future Pokemon. It's the other half of the Paradox Pokemon as opposed to Ancient. And future Pokemon are kind of like the battle styles again, specifically more like Rapid Strike and Fusion Strike. And they kind of synergize with each other and do some pretty fun stuff. But anyways, I really hope you enjoyed the video. I spent a while on it, so I'd love it if you subscribed. And of course, comment down below any cards you think I should have added, or cards that you would have personally removed. But also make sure to like the video, join the channel as well if you want to support me. But I hope you all enjoyed, and I'm excited to see you in the next video.